That family dinner was supposed to be a low-key gathering, a chance to honor hard work, acknowledge progress, and share in something we could collectively feel proud of. My name is Ariana. I'm in my early 30s, and as I took my seat at that table, I genuinely thought the evening was about celebrating academic milestones and a new home, not about assigning value or quietly rewriting history. The tone shifted the moment success entered the conversation. My sister spoke with polished confidence, detailing how she had single-handedly managed everything, from tuition to living expenses, shaping her story into a testament of grit and self-reliance. Around the table, heads nodded in approval, settling into the narrative as though it required no second thought. Then she turned toward me with a smile that felt calculated, making a remark that subtly painted me as someone who coasted on others' efforts without contributing anything substantial. It was delivered politely enough to pass as harmless, but pointed enough to position me beneath her in front of everyone. I responded without raising my voice, asking a straightforward question meant to clarify what I knew to be false. Before I could finish, my mother cut me off, her tone sharp and absolute. "Shut up. You don't have the right to speak in this house." My sister avoided my gaze, letting the silence shield her version of events, while no one stepped forward to challenge what had just happened. In that instant, I understood my role was not to be heard, but to remain useful only when it benefited them. I left the table without another word, carrying a quiet resolve with me, because I knew that by morning, money would speak louder than anything I had been silenced from saying. If you want to understand what unfolded after I walked away that evening, and why nothing in my family stayed the same afterward, stay with me for the next part. Long before that dinner, this dynamic had already taken root in a subtle, unspoken way, without formal agreements or discussion, until everyone simply accepted it as the natural order. I had reliable income, steady hours, and bank accounts that never fell into the red. So, financial responsibility quietly shifted onto me without anyone ever asking if I was willing to bear it or how long it was meant to continue. Camille, my sister, was still in school when it started. At first, the requests were specific and seemed reasonable. Tuition deadlines approached, enrollment confirmations landed in her inbox, and payment notices arrived with tight windows. She would text me screenshots from the school portal and follow up immediately. "The deadline is today. If it's not paid, they'll hold my spot." I transferred the funds that same day, believing it was a temporary measure tied strictly to her education. A few months later, Camille asked to use one of my cards for routine expenses. She said it would simplify things while she juggled classes and deadlines. She mentioned groceries, gas, and textbooks, framing them as essentials rather than luxuries. I agreed with one condition. The card was to be used only for basics, and I expected to stay informed. Her reply came quickly. "I'll only use it when I really need to." That condition held only until the card was activated. Charges started appearing more frequently than anticipated. The amounts grew, the timing became erratic, and the explanations grew thinner. When I asked about a purchase that didn't align with our agreement, the answer came late or not at all. Sometimes it was a vague reassurance. Other times, it was a promise to explain later that never materialized into a conversation. Mom and Dad reinforced the arrangement whenever I hesitated. They reminded me that I was working full-time, that I had stability, and that family helped family without keeping score. When I sought clarity, even gently, they framed it as discomfort rather than a legitimate concern. Mom said I was turning money into tension. Dad said support didn't need to be renegotiated once it had begun. Their message was consistent, even when the details weren't. I stayed quiet longer than I should have. I didn't want to be seen as difficult or accused of burdening someone still in school. I also knew that if I pulled back, no one else would fill the gap. Each new expense arrived framed as urgent and unavoidable, presented as though it had already been approved. The expectation wasn't discussed, it was enforced by timing. Over time, decisions were made without my input. Tuition amounts changed, card limits increased, and charges appeared that had nothing to do with academics. I noticed patterns rather than isolated incidents. Payments processed late at night. Spending spiked on weekends. Receipts no longer matched the explanations I received. When I asked simple questions, the responses were vague or delayed, as if transparency had become optional. Despite how visible the imbalance had grown, it was never addressed openly. The situation remained protected by routine and reinforced by expectation. I wasn't consulted before commitments were made. Yet, I was expected to fulfill them on time and without complaint. What began as help for school had quietly morphed into something else entirely, though no one was willing to name it. Acknowledging the shift would have meant admitting that support was no longer temporary or limited. It had silently become entitlement, and by then, everyone except me seemed comfortable pretending nothing had changed. A few weeks later, something began to feel off. Not because of one large transaction, but because of how frequently small charges started appearing without context. I logged into my account one evening to review the statements more carefully, expecting to see the same categories I had already accepted. Instead, the list felt cluttered, amounts that added up faster than they should have, and vendors that had nothing to do with school or basic living. At first, I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. I went line by line, checking dates, locations, and descriptions, trying to understand how expenses labeled as routine could originate from places that didn't match what Camille had described earlier. There were charges during hours when classes should have been in session, payments clustered over weekends, and recurring transactions that suggested habits rather than necessities. None of it looked like an emergency, yet all of it was treated as expected. The monthly total kept increasing, not dramatically in one jump, but steadily enough that it became noticeable. Each statement ended higher than the last without any message or warning. No one mentioned a change in needs, a new requirement from school, or an unexpected expense that justified the shift. The silence around it made the numbers feel heavier than they were. I reached out to Camille directly instead of assuming the worst. I didn't raise my voice or accuse her of anything. I sent a simple message and asked one clear question. Can you explain what these charges are for? It was the kind of question that left room for honesty, if there was any. Her response came back quickly, dismissive in tone and short on detail. It's just normal expenses. You're overthinking it. There was no breakdown, no acknowledgement of the differences I had noticed, and no attempt to clarify why spending had grown so quickly. The message read as if my concern itself was the problem, not the activity behind it. I didn't argue with her then. I didn't push back or list the transactions one by one. I knew from experience that doing so would only turn the conversation defensive rather than productive. Instead, I thanked her for responding and told her I just wanted to make sure everything was being tracked properly. The conversation ended there, unresolved but noted. From that point on, I started paying closer attention. I saved statements, took screenshots, and marked dates when spending spiked without explanation. I compared one month to the next, not to build a case, but to understand whether what I was seeing was temporary or becoming a pattern. The more I tracked it, the clearer it became that this was not a misunderstanding or a one-time lapse. What stood out most was how comfortable everyone seemed with the lack of transparency. There was no follow-up from Camille, no clarification from mom or dad, and no acknowledgement that the arrangement might need revisiting. The expectation remained the same, even as the details changed quietly underneath it. I made a conscious decision not to bring this up in front of the family. I didn't want a public argument or a scene built on numbers that only I had seen. I believed that a private conversation would give space for honesty without pressure. I told myself that if I handled it calmly and directly, there was still a chance to reset the boundaries without escalating the situation. That decision wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about choosing the right moment to address something that had already crossed from generosity into assumption. I wanted clarity, not validation, and I wanted it without turning money into a weapon. At that stage, I still believed the issue could be resolved quietly before it grew into something that could no longer be ignored. Not long after that, I tried to talk it through, choosing a moment when emotions were calm and there was no audience waiting to react. I asked Camille to sit down with me privately because I wanted clarity, not an argument, and because I believed that if we spoke honestly without pressure, there was still room to fix what had started to feel wrong. I brought actual numbers with me, not summaries or impressions. I showed her the recent statements, pointing out specific charges that didn't match what we had originally agreed on. I explained that the issue wasn't one transaction, but the pattern itself, the steady increase, the lack of notice, and the absence of explanations. I told her I needed to understand where the money was going if I was expected to keep paying. Camille's reaction was immediate and defensive. Her posture shifted, and her tone hardened as soon as she realized this wasn't a casual check-in. She looked at the statements only briefly before pushing them aside. "Why are you treating me like I did something wrong?" she asked, as if the question itself was an accusation. Instead of addressing the numbers, she focused on how my concerns made her feel, framing the conversation as an attack rather than a request for transparency. I tried to keep my voice steady and explained again that I wasn't accusing her of anything. I told her I was asking for clarity because I was responsible for the payments. I reminded her of the limits we had discussed at the beginning and how those limits had slowly disappeared without any conversation. She shook her head and said I was exaggerating the situation, insisting that nothing unusual was happening and that I was making things more complicated than necessary. Before the conversation could go any further, Mom stepped in. She had been listening from nearby and didn't ask to see the statements or hear the details. Her response was firm and immediate. "Stop interrogating your sister," she said, making it clear that my questions were the problem, not the spending itself. The word interrogating stuck with me because it implied guilt where none had been proven. No numbers were explained. No boundaries were agreed on. What I received instead was a clear message about my place in the arrangement. I was expected to continue providing support without oversight, without questions, and without acknowledgement of my concerns. As I walked away from that conversation, I understood that this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be corrected with another talk. It was a system that worked for everyone except me, and it was being actively defended by the people I had hoped would be willing to listen. That weekend, everything finally came into the open, not because anyone planned for it to happen, but because the truth had been carried into the room and left there without protection. The dinner was framed as a celebration meant to acknowledge progress, effort, and milestones that the family believed were worth applauding. Relatives filled the space with casual conversation, and the focus naturally shifted toward Camille as soon as everyone settled in. Camille stood comfortably among them, speaking with ease and confidence, describing her academic progress and the recent purchase of her house as if both were the result of discipline and careful planning. She talked about long days, personal sacrifices, and how proud she was to stand on her own. Heads nodded around the table, and a few people smiled in admiration, clearly impressed by the picture she was painting. At one point, a relative leaned forward and asked where she had found the financial stability to manage school and a home at the same time. Camille didn't hesitate. "I worked hard for it," she said, her tone firm and unqualified, as if there were no other details worth mentioning. The table responded with approving murmurs, and the conversation threatened to move on, as if that answer had closed the subject. I felt the shift before I spoke, the moment when silence would have made me complicit. I looked directly at her and said, "That's not true, and you know it." The words landed heavier than I expected, not because they were loud, but because they interrupted a story everyone wanted to believe. The room went still, and Camille avoided my eyes, focusing instead on her glass, as if the truth might dissolve if she didn't acknowledge it. Before she could respond, Mom stepped in sharply. "This is not the time or place," she said, her voice cutting through the pause with practiced authority. She didn't ask what I meant or invite clarification. Her goal wasn't understanding, but containment. Dad followed quickly, adding that family gatherings were meant for unity, not confrontation, and that any issues could be handled privately. Later, Camille remained silent through it all, neither confirming nor denying what I had said. She let the moment pass, protected by the intervention, while the attention slowly shifted away from her and toward me. A few relatives glanced in my direction, some uncomfortable, others curious, but no one asked questions. No one asked her to respond. The story she had told remained intact, simply reinforced by the decision to move on. I realized then that this wasn't just about money or recognition. It was about who was allowed to speak and who was expected to stay quiet for the sake of appearances. I had been given my answer already, not through words, but through the way the room chose comfort over honesty. The silence that followed felt intentional, almost rehearsed, as if this outcome had always been the safest one. I didn't raise my voice or push the issue further. I understood that anything else I said would be framed as disruption rather than correction. I stood up calmly, thanked everyone for coming, and excused myself without waiting for a response. No one tried to stop me. No one asked me to stay. Camille didn't look up. As I walked away from the table, I felt an unexpected sense of clarity. The decision had already been made by everyone else, even if they didn't realize it yet. I left the dinner without another word, carrying a quiet certainty, because I knew that by the next morning, the truth would no longer need my voice. The money would speak for itself. Later that night, I didn't go straight home because the silence waiting for me there felt heavier than the drive itself. Instead of turning toward my apartment, I kept going until the streets thinned out and my thoughts finally had space to surface. For the first time, I replayed everything without defending anyone, without filling in excuses, and without explaining my own behavior to make it sound reasonable. When I looked at my family from the outside, the pattern was no longer subtle. I wasn't the helper. I was the solution everyone relied on while pretending it happened naturally. I met my best friend, Nora Hayes, at a quiet place we had gone to for years, the kind where no one rushed you and no one listened too closely. She looked at my face before I even spoke and said I didn't need to start from the beginning. Still, I told her everything, from the first tuition payment to the card charges, the private confrontation, and the moment at the dinner when the room decided that silence was easier than truth. I didn't dramatize it. I listed facts, numbers, reactions, and the way each conversation ended without resolution. Nora listened without interrupting, her expression steady and focused, not sympathetic in a way that softened reality. When I finally stopped talking, she leaned back and asked a single question that cut through everything I had been circling. What would happen if you stopped paying? Her voice was calm, almost clinical, as if she were asking about a system rather than a family. The question landed harder than any accusation could have. I opened my mouth to answer and realized I had no idea because no one had ever discussed that possibility. The structure of my family didn't include contingency plans. It assumed continuity, compliance, and my quiet participation. I said that they would probably be angry, confused, or offended, and Nora nodded as if that confirmed something rather than challenged it. She followed up without raising her voice. If the only thing holding everything together is your money, then that tells you exactly where you stand. I didn't feel attacked by her words. I felt exposed, as if someone had finally named the role I had been performing without acknowledging it. I wasn't valued for judgment or honesty. I was valued for reliability and access. I realized then that I had spent years trying to be understood when what I actually needed was clarity. I wasn't looking for comfort, reassurance, or validation anymore. I wanted to see the situation without emotion blurring the edges. And that clarity was uncomfortable because it removed my last excuse to stay still. If I continued paying, nothing would change. If I explained again, I would be told I was complicating things. The only variable left was action. Nora didn't tell me what to do. She didn't suggest ultimatums or dramatic confrontations. She simply said, "You already know the answer. You're just deciding whether you're ready to live with it." That sentence stayed with me longer than the conversation itself because it shifted responsibility back where it belonged, not onto my family but onto my own choices. By the time we parted ways, my thoughts felt settled in a way they never had before. I understood that explanation had become a trap, something that kept me engaged without producing change. Action didn't require permission or agreement. It required resolve. I went home that night knowing I would stop trying to justify myself, because the next step would speak far more clearly than any conversation ever had. Several days later, I made my decision. Not during a dramatic moment or after another argument, but in the calm space that followed clarity. I had already run through every possible conversation in my head, every explanation that might soften the reaction, and every warning that would invite negotiation. None of those options matched what I needed to do next. I understood that any announcement would only reopen the same cycle, so I chose silence and precision instead. The first step was straightforward. When the next tuition deadline appeared in my email, I closed the message without forwarding it or setting a reminder. I had paid so many of those invoices before that ignoring one felt almost unnatural. Yet I knew exactly what it meant. There was no call to the school, no partial payment, and no message asking for an extension. The system would handle the consequences on its own timeline without my involvement or signature attached to it. The second step required less emotion and more procedure. I logged into my account and navigated to the card settings that had once felt temporary but had quietly become permanent. I reviewed the recent charges one last time, not to convince myself, but to confirm that my choice was grounded in facts rather than anger. Then I suspended access with a few clicks, following the same security prompts I had ignored for months. The confirmation appeared on the screen, clean and final, and I logged out without hesitation. The reaction came sooner than I expected. Camille called me that afternoon, her voice tight and confused, skipping any greeting that suggested concern for anything other than inconvenience. "Why isn't my card working?" she asked, as if the issue were a technical glitch that I could fix immediately. I didn't raise my voice or explain the history behind the decision. I answered once, carefully, and without room for debate. "I'm not funding this anymore." There was a pause, long enough for me to imagine her recalculating the situation in real time. She started to speak again, shifting from confusion to frustration, but I ended the call before the conversation could expand into accusations or justifications. I didn't feel guilty for doing so. I felt deliberate, which was a new sensation in this context. Within minutes, messages followed, some sharp, some pleading, each one assuming that I would eventually respond if pressed hard enough. I didn't. Later that evening, Mom texted me, not to ask how I was, but to demand an explanation framed as concern. She wrote that this wasn't how family handled things, that Camille was under pressure, and that I needed to be reasonable. The message carried the familiar tone that suggested resolution was my responsibility alone. I read it once and set the phone down without replying, recognizing that engagement would only reassign me to the role I had just stepped out of. What surprised me wasn't their reaction, but my own. I didn't feel the rush to fix the situation or to smooth over discomfort. There was no urge to clarify my intentions or defend my reasoning. The quiet that followed was heavy, but it was also honest. For the first time, the imbalance was no longer hidden behind my compliance. It was exposed by absence rather than confrontation. I went to sleep that night knowing that my silence wasn't avoidance. It was a boundary expressed through action, one that didn't require agreement or validation to exist. Whatever followed would no longer depend on how well I explained myself, because the system I had been supporting had already changed. I hadn't announced my decision to the family, but its impact was unmistakable, and that was enough. In the days that followed, the silence said everything in a way no argument ever had. Without my payments moving quietly in the background, reality began to press in on Camille almost immediately. Bills that used to clear without notice now sat unresolved. Tuition reminders turned into warning emails, and everyday expenses demanded explanations she could no longer avoid. There was no dramatic collapse, just a steady tightening that exposed how fragile her confidence had always been once my support disappeared. The stories she had told others unraveled just as quickly. The claims about independence and self-discipline lost their weight when deadlines passed and excuses multiplied. Conversations that once centered on her achievements shifted toward logistics and limitations. People stopped asking what she was planning next and started asking how she intended to manage what was already overdue. Without money behind the image could no longer stand on its own. Mom and Dad tried at first to regain control of the situation the only way they knew how. Messages came with familiar language about family obligation and shared responsibility. But something had changed in the balance of power. They were no longer speaking from a position of leverage because there was nothing they could threaten to take away. When pressure didn't produce a response, The tone softened, then stalled, and eventually faded into silence that mirrored my own. I didn't respond to any of it. I blocked numbers, muted threads, and removed myself from spaces where the same expectations might resurface under a different name. This wasn't an emotional decision made in anger, but a deliberate step to protect the clarity I had fought to gain. I focused on my work, my routines, and relationships that didn't rely on what I could provide financially. For the first time in a long while, my days weren't shaped by other people's demands. There was no reconciliation, no final conversation where everyone admitted fault, and no attempt to restore what had existed before. I didn't feel the need to justify that choice to myself or anyone else. The distance created wasn't empty. It was stable. It allowed me to see how much energy I had spent maintaining an arrangement that never offered respect in return. Cutting contact wasn't a punishment, but a boundary made permanent. Camille adapted in her own way, as people eventually do when circumstances force them to. Mom and Dad adjusted to the limits they could no longer cross. None of that required my involvement, and that was the point. I didn't step back in when things became uncomfortable because discomfort was the only honest teacher left in that dynamic. My role had ended, and I didn't look back to see what filled the space I left behind. What remained for me was quiet certainty. I had learned that stepping away doesn't mean failure, and that silence can be a form of truth when words have been exhausted. I chose a life where support was mutual, expectations were clear, and respect wasn't conditional. That choice didn't come with applause, but it came with peace. And that was enough to mark the end of the story. Support only has meaning when it exists alongside honesty and respect. When a relationship survives solely because one person keeps paying, the imbalance will always grow until it causes harm. Walking away from that role isn't cruelty or abandonment, but an act of self-preservation. Setting boundaries doesn't erase love, yet it protects dignity, which no amount of money can replace once it's lost. Thank you for taking the time to stay with this story until the end. Your attention, empathy, and willingness to reflect mean more than you may realize. If this situation raised questions or reminded you of your own experiences, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Conversations about family, money, and boundaries deserve space, honesty, and respect.